When I first bought the old lakefront cabin nestled deep in the woods of Clearwater Ridge, I felt like I had finally found something that belonged entirely to me. Not just a house, not just a property, but a piece of peace. After nearly 2 decades spent buried in deadlines, meetings, commutes, and a marriage that slowly eroded under the weight of 2 different lives, I needed space. Not metaphorically. I wanted trees instead of traffic, birdsong instead of buzzing phones, stars instead of streetlights. So I cashed in my savings, finalized my divorce, and went looking for a place to start over. That's when I saw the listing. It was almost laughably simple. Off-grid cabin. 5 acres. Lake access. Needs work. No fancy photos. No drone shots. But something about it pulled me in. I drove up to Clearwater Ridge that same weekend and stood there in front of the weathered pine structure, staring at the sagging porch, the cracked chimney, and the crooked windows with chipped green shutters. The roof leaked, the floorboards groaned under each step, and there was no insulation worth mentioning. But I didn't see problems, I saw freedom. Every flaw whispered opportunity. And when I looked past the overgrown trail, past the thickets of blackberry bushes and the massive oak leaning like a tired sentinel near the water, I saw the glimmering lake reflecting the sky like a mirror. I bought the place that same week. No agents, no haggling. I made sure to check everything. The title, the deed, easements, mineral rights, property lines, every legal detail. I was crystal clear. I didn't want to deal with an HOA, with neighborhood committees, with anyone telling me what color I could paint my door or where I could park my truck. My realtor confirmed it. The property was outside any HOA jurisdiction. A rare find these days. That made my decision even easier. Moving in felt like breathing for the first time in years. I spent the first month just cleaning, repairing, and quietly adjusting to the rhythm of the land. I fixed the roof, scrubbed away decades of grime, and sanded down the splintered porch with my own hands. I chopped firewood and watched the sunrise every morning from a rocking chair I found half buried in the shed. I didn't own a TV. I didn't check email. I didn't even have cell service most of the time, and it was glorious. I started planting vegetables in the back. I built a dock out onto the lake with reclaimed lumber. I took long walks in the morning mist and sat beside the fire at night, wrapped in a flannel blanket, listening to the wind rustle the trees. And one of the very first things I did, one of the things I was most proud of, was build a gate. It wasn't a massive thing. Just a simple cedar gate, wide enough for a car to pass through, with sturdy wooden posts and old-style iron hinges. I carved the top rail myself, staining it to match the natural wood grain of the forest. It blended right into the tree line. On one post, I hung a small wooden sign with the name I gave to the property, Ridge End. Not for privacy, not even for security really, just for the symbolism of it. A marker. A line that said, "This is mine." Beyond this gate, I answered to no one. And for months, everything was perfect. A few hikers occasionally wandered close by, and a kayaker once waved from the lake, but otherwise I was completely left alone. Exactly as I wanted. Then one morning in early October, I stepped outside to find a neatly folded letter tucked between the gate and its post. It was printed on crisp white paper with a blue header that read, Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association. My first reaction was confusion, followed quickly by disbelief. The letter stated that the gate I had installed was in clear violation of the community's architectural design standards, and that I was to remove it within 30 days or face escalating fines, starting at $100 per day. I laughed. Felt like a joke. Oh? I had specifically avoided any property under an HOA's thumb. I had the deed to prove it. I called my realtor that afternoon, slightly amused but wanting to be sure. She pulled up the property records right away. "You're not part of any HOA," she said, baffled. "You're on a private parcel outside their boundaries. They shouldn't even be contacting you." I agreed. I tossed the letter in the fireplace, watched it curl into ash, and went back to my peaceful life. But that was just the beginning. I thought the issue was dead and buried with that letter. Honestly, I didn't think about it again for nearly 2 weeks. But one chilly morning in late October, while chopping kindling near the shed, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. It was rare for anyone to come up the road, especially uninvited, so I dropped the axe and stepped around the corner. A white SUV was slowly making its way up the path, tires bouncing over roots and loose rock. As it reached my gate, it came to a halt. Out stepped a woman in a dark blazer, clipboard in hand, followed by a man wearing a puffy vest and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. They didn't open the gate. They just stood in front of it, staring at the structure like it had personally offended them. I walked down the driveway toward them, wiping my hands on my flannel. The woman looked up and forced a tight smile. "Good morning," she said. "We're with the Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association." She held up the clipboard like it was a badge of authority. "We left you a notice earlier this month. I'm afraid we haven't received confirmation of compliance." I raised an eyebrow. "That's because I'm not part of your HOA." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Our records show that this parcel falls within the historical boundaries of Clearwater Ridge Phase 2, which..." "It doesn't," I cut in. I checked the title, deed, county maps and spoke to my realtor. "This property was never included in any subdivision or development phase. It's privately owned. No covenants. No restrictions. I am not subject to your association." The man in the sunglasses finally spoke. "The original developer may have made some filing errors back in the 90s. We're in the process of correcting those. In the meantime, all properties within the geographic boundary are expected to comply with the community guidelines." I laughed, but it wasn't friendly. "So let me get this straight. Your association thinks my land might have been incorrectly excluded decades ago, and while you try to fix your paperwork, you expect me to just follow your rules?" The woman's smile disappeared now. "We've already sent you a second notice. If this gate is not removed within 14 days, we'll begin issuing daily fines. And if necessary, we'll take legal action to bring the property into compliance." "Legal action?" I echoed. "For building a gate on my own land which your group has no claim over?" She nodded once, crisp and businesslike. "It's not personal. It's about maintaining community standards." I didn't say what I was thinking, but every instinct in me, every ounce of peace this cabin had given me, began to churn with quiet fury. I told them I'd be speaking to my lawyer and asked them to leave. They took some photos of the gate before driving off, slowly, like they wanted to make a point of it. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire rereading the property documents. Everything was airtight. I owned 5 acres, purchased directly from the original private owner. No covenants. No shared roads. No dues. The nearest HOA-governed house was over a quarter-mile away, down a different road entirely. What they were doing wasn't just harassment, it was overreach. And potentially illegal. So the next day I called a local property attorney in town, explained the situation, and sent over the deed and legal descriptions. 2 days later he called me back with a firm voice and a touch of disbelief. "You're right," he said. "They have no claim over your property. Zero. This land was specifically excluded when the Clearwater Ridge development was expanded. There's even a plat note on file that mentions this lot as independent and unrestricted. What they're doing is unenforceable, and if they escalate, you've got a solid case for damages." That should have reassured me. And in part it did. But another part of me burned with anger. Why should I have to spend time and money defending my rights against people who had no authority here? What gave them the audacity to drive onto my road, demand compliance and threaten legal action, all based on imaginary boundaries and outdated paperwork? But I didn't back down. Instead, I took a stand. I drafted a formal cease and desist letter with my attorney's help. It outlined the property's legal status, included attachments from the county records office, and warned of legal consequences if they continued to harass, trespass, or attempt to impose fines. I sent copies via registered mail to the HOA board, their legal counsel, and the management company. I also installed a trail camera at the edge of the gatepost, just in case they decided to come snooping around again. And sure enough, a week later someone did. Around 2 a.m. on a Thursday, the camera pinged my phone. The grainy footage showed a man with a flashlight approaching the gate, clipboard in hand. He didn't try to open it, just took pictures and walked back to a truck parked down the trail. That was the last straw. I turned the footage over to my lawyer and filed a report with the sheriff's office. A deputy came out the next day, took my statement and said I'd done the right thing. "They've pulled this kind of thing before," he said, shaking his head. "But they've never tried it on someone with their paperwork in order. Keep standing your ground." And I did. If the HOA thought I was going to quietly give in, they had clearly never dealt with someone like me. I wasn't just defending a gate, I was defending the principle of autonomy, the right to own a piece of land and not have it hijacked by some overzealous committee with clipboards and vague threats. After the sheriff's report and the cease and desist letter, I expected things to finally calm down. For about 2 weeks they did. No more late-night visits, no strange cars crawling up the gravel path, no more threatening letters. I could feel my shoulders starting to loosen again, the tension beginning to leave my chest. I spent a few afternoons on the dock reading. I even had a friend come up from the city, and we grilled trout over a fire pit and laughed about how ridiculous the situation had become. But just when I thought it was over, I received a certified letter in the mail, this time from a law firm. The envelope was thick, official, and reeked of the kind of corporate arrogance I had moved out here to escape. The letter claimed that the HOA was moving forward with what they called a quiet title action in county court. They were seeking to retroactively annex my property into the HOA boundaries, arguing that clerical errors in historical filings had excluded my lot contrary to the original developer's intent. Their argument was that, although my deed stated otherwise, my land was always meant to be included. Therefore, they claimed the association had a right to correct the error and bring my parcel into compliance. I read the letter 3 times, pacing the cabin with growing disbelief. I'd heard of HOA overreach before. Horror stories on the internet, news segments about people being fined for the wrong shade of curtains or leaving trash cans visible for 10 minutes too long. But this wasn't a petty fine or a strongly worded warning. This was an attempt to change the legal status of my property, to forcibly bind me to rules and fees I had never agreed to. I called my lawyer again. He sounded irritated but not surprised. "This is bold," he admitted, "but not impossible for them to attempt. However, and this is a big however, we have the original filings, subdivision maps, and the legal history on our side. It's a nuisance suit, nothing more. But we'll need to fight it properly." So we did. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of paperwork, court filings, and tense meetings. I had to submit notarized statements, hire a land surveyor to re-verify the boundaries, and gather every scrap of documentation related to the cabin's history. The legal fees were mounting, but I wasn't about to let some suburban boardroom warriors rewrite reality just because they felt entitled. Every day I walked past that gate, the same simple wooden structure I had lovingly built with my own hands, and reminded myself what I was fighting for. It wasn't about wood and hinges. It was about freedom. Just ownership. Then something unexpected happened. My attorney suggested we take the case to the local media. "People love stories like this," he said. "One person standing up to a powerful HOA. It could put public pressure on them to back off." At first, I hesitated. I wasn't looking for attention, quite the opposite. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. If they could do this to me, they could do it to others. Maybe they already had. So I agreed. We contacted a local journalist from the county paper. She came up one morning, took photos of the cabin, the gate, the surrounding woods, and interviewed me for over 2 hours. I showed her the letters, the court documents, the footage from the trail camera. She was stunned. "They're trying to rewrite the rules after the fact?" she asked, scribbling furiously. "You're not even part of their neighborhood." The article ran the following week with the headline, "Man Fights HOA Attempt to Seize Control of Private Cabin Property." It went viral, at least locally, then regionally, then, surprisingly, nationally. Within days, I was getting messages from strangers all over the country. Some were lawyers offering advice, others were homeowners sharing similar horror stories. My story had struck a nerve. The public support changed everything. Suddenly, the HOA's legal team wasn't so smug. The local courthouse was flooded with letters of support, and I was invited onto a radio show to talk about the case. A city council member even called me privately to say she was keeping an eye on things, and didn't appreciate how the HOA was giving the region a bad name. The pressure was mounting, but so was the fight. The court date was set for mid-December, and by then, the lake had begun to freeze at its edges. Mornings arrived wrapped in mist and silence, except for the distant crack of ice shifting against the dock. The beauty of it all clashed hard against the growing weight in my chest. I hadn't imagined that owning a small cabin in the woods could turn into a full-scale legal battle. But here I was, preparing for a hearing that would determine whether or not my autonomy could be taken from me because someone decided a 30-year-old filing error gave them permission. My lawyer, James Gresham, a sharp, no-nonsense local with a calm manner and a reputation for hating HOA overreach, had prepared everything. He stacked our documentation like bricks in a fortress, certified copies of the original plat maps, signed declarations from the previous owner stating the land was never governed by any association, statements from the county clerk's office, and even a letter from a former Clearwater Ridge developer who had since retired to Arizona. That man, now in his 70s, wrote a scathing note confirming that my parcel had been intentionally excluded from the HOA in the early 2000s, precisely because it was inaccessible from the community roads and had its own independent access. "We never intended for Lot 12B to be included," he wrote. "It was sold privately as a standalone property, and no HOA dues or rights were ever applied to it. But what really turned the tide even before we stepped into court was the discovery of a document James found in the county archives. A single, dusty sheet from a 2001 HOA meeting in which the board explicitly voted to not pursue incorporation of 3 properties, mine included. The reasoning? Geographic isolation, legal risk, and anticipated owner resistance. That was all the evidence we needed to show that this wasn't just a clerical oversight, it was deliberate. Still, the HOA wasn't backing down. In the days leading up to the hearing, they ramped up their efforts. They filed a motion claiming I had benefited from being near their maintained roads and that by proximity, I owed them reasonable dues. They said my property visually impacted the community aesthetic, even though no member of the HOA could see my gate without trespassing into the forest. They even attempted to argue that my trail access road, though privately maintained, intersected with community property. It didn't, it connected directly to a public service road maintained by the county. That week, 2 more articles ran in local media. One favorable, one clearly fed by the HOA's PR team. It painted me as a recluse with a defensive attitude, and accused me of weaponizing public opinion. I was shocked by the tone. It didn't just misrepresent the facts, it twisted them to make me seem like the aggressor. But I didn't respond publicly. I knew the truth and soon a judge would know it too. When the day finally arrived, I wore a pressed shirt and boots. Nothing flashy, just clean and respectful. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, with a ceiling fan that clicked quietly above us. Across from me sat the HOA board's attorney, a polished man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Beside him sat 2 board members, including the same woman who had first shown up at my gate. Her expression was unreadable. The hearing began with the judge reviewing preliminary filings, then listening as the HOA's lawyer laid out their case. Historical ambiguity, community integration, intended inclusion, all wrapped in legal terminology designed to confuse. But James dismantled their points one by one, methodically, calmly, with evidence and documentation for every counterargument. He called attention to the retired developer's letter, then submitted the 2001 meeting minutes into evidence. The judge raised his eyebrows at that. Then James did something that surprised even me. He called a witness. A neighbor. Technically, the closest homeowner under HOA jurisdiction. A kind, older man named Richard who owned a vacation home about half a mile downhill. Richard took the stand and calmly told the court that in the 12 years he'd owned his property, not once had he seen my land as part of the community. It's completely isolated, he said. You have to walk through dense woods to even reach it. I always thought it was a separate property. And frankly, if someone bought that place thinking they'd be left alone, they shouldn't be harassed now. The judge nodded slowly. The HOA's lawyer objected. Irrelevance, he said, but the damage had been done. By the end of the hearing, it was clear where the wind was blowing. The judge concluded by saying he would review everything and deliver a formal ruling within 10 business days. But his final remark before adjourning gave me hope. This appears to be a case of administrative ambition outpacing legal foundation. I walked out of that courtroom lighter than I had felt in weeks. But I knew it still wasn't over. Not quite yet. The 10-day wait for the verdict felt like standing in fog. Each morning I woke to the icy silence of the lake, the stillness of the woods, and a knot in my chest that refused to loosen. I spent the days cutting firewood, finishing repairs on the roof, and rereading the court transcripts and exhibits like they were sacred texts. I told myself over and over, you did everything right. You have the law on your side. But still, some part of me feared what might come, because as anyone who's dealt with bureaucracies knows, being right doesn't always mean you win. On the 9th day, just before sunset, the letter arrived by courier. Heavy envelope. County seal. No emotion, no drama, just one official sheet of paper with the judge's ruling. I read it 3 times before I let myself breathe. Petition denied. The court found the HOA's claims unfounded, their actions based on speculative reinterpretation of legal documents, and their attempted annexation of my land, without legal merit or jurisdiction. The judge went further, stating that their campaign to compel compliance through threats of fines and legal action amounted to harassment, and that I was entitled to seek damages, if I so chose. I sat down on the porch, holding that letter in my hands like a trophy. I didn't cry, but I felt something close to it. Relief. Vindication. Power maybe. Not the kind that comes from control, but the kind that comes from surviving something that tried to take a part of you and failed. But even in that victory, questions lingered. Why had the HOA pursued this so aggressively? Why now, after decades of silence? What had changed? The answer came 2 weeks later, not through lawyers or court filings, but from a retired county clerk who had followed the case in the papers. He sent me a handwritten letter and a flash drive. Inside was a PDF scan of a land use proposal dated 8 months earlier, one that had never been made public. It outlined a plan for a new luxury lakefront development labeled Clearwater Ridge Expansion Phase 4. The proposed access road? It ran right through my property. My gate, my little handmade gate, was sitting directly in the path of what they hoped would be their entry point for construction vehicles. Suddenly it all made sense. The HOA hadn't just wanted me to take down a gate. They had wanted to soften the ground, to slowly bring my parcel under their control so they could eventually sell it or negotiate access rights. It wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't about community harmony. It was about money. I stared at the proposal for an hour. Page after page of diagrams, investor memos, and internal notes about easement acquisition. Nowhere in the document did they mention that the land in question was privately owned and exempt from HOA authority. They just called it undeveloped buffer zone. Rage flared again, but this time it was different. Cold. Focused. I contacted my attorney and gave him everything. Within days we filed a complaint with the State Real Estate Board and sent formal letters to every member of the HOA board, informing them that their actions appeared to be part of a coordinated attempt to misrepresent ownership boundaries for potential financial gain. We also notified local press outlets and public land use watchdogs. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore, it was a case of potential fraud. The fallout came quickly. One board member resigned within a week. Another released a public statement claiming they had no knowledge of the development plans and had only followed legal advice. The HOA's legal team went silent. I was invited to speak at a town hall meeting, not something I ever imagined doing, where I laid out everything. The fake boundaries, the harassment, the development proposal. People were furious. Other homeowners began asking questions about what they were being told by the board. Transparency, it seemed, had never been part of the HOA's culture. It wasn't long before an independent audit of the association was launched. Turns out, my case wasn't the only one. At least 3 other property owners, quieter, older folks, had received similar compliance letters that year, pressuring them to adhere to HOA guidelines even though they were legally exempt. They had complied out of fear or confusion. But now they were speaking up. I could have pursued damages. Honestly, I would have won. But I didn't. I had what I needed: my land, my gate, my peace. Instead, I did something symbolic. I installed a small brass plaque next to the gate, engraved with the words, "This land was not given. It was fought for." And every time I open or close that gate, I run my hand over those words, not as a reminder of what happened but as a promise to never let it happen again. After everything, the threats, the lawsuits, the press, the courtroom, the quiet title battle, you might think that the victory would have felt loud like fireworks over a lake. But it didn't. It was quiet. Heavy even. Like the silence after a storm has passed, when everything is still, but you're too worn out to fully enjoy the sun coming back out. I went weeks without hearing from anyone on the HOA board, and frankly that was a blessing. No more letters. No more clipboard inspections. No more phantom SUV creeping up the gravel path in the early morning. The silence became my reward. The stillness I had moved here for had finally been restored, and this time it felt earned. The lake froze solid by January. I spent the winter alone as I always planned, chopping wood, cooking over the old iron stove, working on small projects inside the cabin. The world outside kept turning. More news stories about land rights, HOA overreach, and privacy battles. My name came up sometimes, but I stopped reading the articles. I wasn't trying to be some poster child for property rights or rural independence. I just wanted to be left alone on my own land, a request that should never have become radical. But in some ways the experience changed me. Before all this, I'd chosen solitude for healing. After the divorce, after losing my job in a mass layoff, I had come to Clearwater Ridge because I wanted to escape. I didn't want neighbors or social circles or anyone asking how I was doing. But through this mess, through the fight and the support I unexpectedly received, I found connection again. Not the superficial kind you get from polite small talk, but the kind that grows out of shared values, mutual defense, and quiet respect. Richard, the neighbor who testified on my behalf in court, began stopping by once or twice a month after the case ended. He'd bring fresh baked bread or deer sausage from his hunting trips. Sometimes he didn't stay long, just left things on the porch with a note. Other times we'd share a beer by the fire talking about nothing in particular. Turns out, he'd spent most of his adult life in the military, then worked 30 years in engineering before retiring out here to escape bureaucracy and bull. We were different men but the same in all the ways that mattered. Other neighbors, people I hadn't even met before the legal battle, started waving when they passed the trailhead in their trucks. A few came by to drop off letters of support or to shake my hand. One woman even brought her teenage son up one Saturday to ask if I'd talk to him about standing your ground with integrity. That felt strange. I wasn't used to being seen as a role model, but I did it. We sat on the porch and talked for an hour. I told him what I wish someone had told me at his age, that independence doesn't mean isolation, and peace is something you often have to defend before you can fully enjoy it. The HOA? Well, they changed too. A few months after the case was dismissed, the board held a vote. 2 more members resigned. The remaining ones implemented a new transparency policy that required members to disclose any legal actions, development plans, or annexation proposals to the entire community before moving forward. I heard, through the grapevine, that they even hired a third-party mediator to help settle disputes, a quiet admission that they'd overstepped. There was no apology, of course. Bureaucracies don't apologize. But they stopped trying to push me around, and that was enough. The brass plaque on my gate remained untouched. Snow piled around it in February, and by March it had turned green with moss. I liked it that way. It looked like it belonged. Just like the gate. Just like me. In April, I took a trip into town to restock supplies. As I loaded bags into the back of my truck, a woman in the parking lot called out my name. I didn't recognize her at first, but she introduced herself as the journalist who'd written the original article. She asked if I was open to doing a follow-up, a piece on what had changed since the case. I politely declined. Not because I was bitter or tired, but because the story for me was over. The fight had been fought. The lines had been drawn. I didn't need to keep telling the world what I had won. Instead, I drove back to the cabin as dusk rolled in, headlights sweeping over the tall pines. I opened the gate, let it swing gently shut behind me, and parked near the porch. The lake was calm again. The trees didn't care what I'd gone through. The wind still moved like it always had, wild, untamed, and free. And for the first time since I'd bought this place, I felt like I could finally just live here. No battles. No noise. Just me. Just the land. And no one to answer to but the trees and the stars. Spring arrived like a whisper rather than a celebration. The snow melted gradually, pulling back like a tide, revealing rocks and twigs beneath. The air took on a sweetness again. Damp pine, blooming wildflowers, the earthy smell of thawed soil. And the cabin, quiet all winter, seemed to stretch and breathe with the changing season. I did too. For the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself to be fully present, not waiting for another letter, another legal form, another knock at the gate. There were no more deadlines, no more standoffs. Just days of sunlight and silence and long walks through the woods behind my property, where even cell signal couldn't follow. By midsummer, the Land Trust sent word that my conservation filing had been approved for preliminary designation. Once finalized, it would protect my land forever. No development, no subdivisions, no rezoning from future boards with bad intentions. It wasn't just about keeping it wild. It was about giving this place the right to stay what it was, a patch of earth allowed to breathe without interruption. There's a moment, late at night, when the wind slides off the hills and glides over the lake in a way that makes the trees rustle just enough to sound like they're whispering. I sat outside during one of those nights, notebook in hand, listening. And I realized, I wasn't just the owner of this land anymore. I was its witness, its voice, its memory keeper. I started writing more often. Not legal documents or journal entries, but reflections. Stories. Moments. What it felt like to wake up to a snow-covered dock. The way the air changed when a storm rolled in. The first time I saw an eagle land in the old oak tree down by the water. Maybe one day I'd turn it into a book. Not about lawsuits or HOA horror stories, but about what it means to fight for silence, for sovereignty, and for something that can't be bought or bulldozed. For now, the gate still stands. The trail camera is long gone. The tension is gone too. Sometimes I open the gate just to let the breeze roll through, and I leave it open for a while, not because I expect company but because I've made peace with the fact that I no longer need to guard it. I didn't just win the right to keep my gate. I won the right to be exactly who I wanted to be, right here where the land ends and my life finally began. The end didn't come with a bang. There were no final battles, no last letters, no symbolic slamming of doors. It just settled. Like dust after wind. Like still water returning after a ripple. And I realized then that real peace doesn't come with fanfare. It comes quietly, sometimes unnoticed, like the moment you wake up and realize you're no longer afraid. You're no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. You've simply become part of the rhythm of the place you fought so hard to belong to. That summer faded into a golden autumn, then slipped gracefully into winter again. Seasons passed like chapters, each one more rooted than the last. The days took on a beautiful sameness: split firewood stacked by the cabin, morning coffee steaming on the porch, the occasional owl perched near the eaves. I found a new rhythm. Not a survival rhythm like before, but one of living, of tending, of noticing the small things that so many people, trapped in the race of modern life, never pause to see. I began to see the land less as something I owned and more as something I was in relationship with. I started planting native grasses where runoff had stripped away the topsoil. I rebuilt the stone wall at the southern edge of the property, not for defense but as a boundary of respect. Every log I split, every trail I cleared felt like a conversation. Not man versus nature, but man in harmony with it. One foggy morning, I spotted a group of hikers wandering near the lake's edge, clearly lost. Normally, that would have triggered old instincts: suspicion, wariness, maybe even the urge to go down and confront them. But something had shifted. I made my way down slowly, greeted them with a calm voice, and helped them reorient themselves. They hadn't meant to cross private land, they just lost their path. When I showed them the map and pointed the way, they thanked me profusely. One of them, a young woman with a DSLR camera slung around her neck, lingered for a moment before they left. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Feels untouched." And I smiled. Because that was exactly the point. Untouched. Not in the sense that no one had ever walked here, but in the deeper sense that the soul of the land had been preserved. That it had resisted the fingerprints of greed, concrete, and control. I watched them disappear back into the woods and didn't think much more about it, until weeks later I received a package in the mail. It was from her. Inside was a small hardcover book, a self-published photo journal. On the first page she had scrawled in pen, "For the man who kept the wilderness wild." The rest of the book was filled with images of places like mine, remote, untouched, quiet corners of the world that still breathed on their own. There were no captions. Just landscapes, trees, lakes, and light. She had included a photo she took of my cabin from across the water, barely visible through the trees. It was humble, honest, and somehow, it felt like a kind of full-circle moment, someone else bearing witness to what I had fought so long to protect. I set the book on the small table by my reading chair. It's still there now, right next to the faded photograph from John Hensley, the former owner who built the first version of my gate. A gate that, once upon a time, symbolized everything I was afraid to lose. Now it just swings quietly when the wind is strong enough, creaking gently, not in protest but in permission. Permission to enter. To pause. To stay. I started keeping a guest book on the porch. Just a notebook in a weathered leather cover. I don't advertise it. But every now and then someone passes through, a lost traveler, a friend of Richard's, a relative of a former neighbor, and they leave behind a few lines. Not just about the view but about the feeling. One man wrote, "The world is too loud. This place reminds me what silence sounds like." Another visitor left a sketch of a fox she spotted near the water. A child drew the gate. What began as a fight for solitude ended up creating something far more lasting. A sense of quiet community. Not the forced kind, not the kind made of rules and dues and meetings. But the kind built on shared reverence for something older than all of us. The lake, the trees, the quiet, they've outlasted the HOA. Outlasted the noise. Outlasted even the part of me that once thought I had to prove anything. Now I wake with no agenda. I sleep with no worry. The world still spins somewhere out there, with its paperwork, its concrete, its noise. But here at the edge of the lake, where the mountains hold the horizon and the wind has no master, I've found what I was truly looking for all along. Not just the right to be left alone, but the peace of knowing I never needed permission in the first place. This cabin is mine. This land is mine. But more importantly, I finally belong to it.